Hello. These are the readings, a little bit of a commentary, and even a little bit of a homily on the 29th Sunday of the year. This year, in 2018, that falls on September the 21st. The first reading is from the fourth song of the suffering servant of Deutero-Isaiah. And remember always, the first three songs of the suffering servant are biographical. Deutero-Isaiah wrote them, autobiographical rather. The last song is biographical, meaning that his disciples wrote this particular song after his martyrdom in reflecting on what Deutero-Isaiah meant for them in their lives. So here's a very poignant section of that fourth song. Yahweh was pleased to crush him in infirmity. If he gives his life as an offering for sin, he shall see his descendants in a long life, and the will of Yahweh shall be accomplished through him. Because of his affliction, he shall see the light in fullness of days. Through his suffering, my servant shall justify many, and their guilt he shall bear. The word of the Lord. The second reading is that rather famous passage from the letter to the Hebrews that talks about Jesus being the high priest. Very interesting metaphor that he uses, that especially we Roman Catholic priests have basically absorbed in certain ways, leaving other sections out, obviously. Brothers and sisters, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who was unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has similarly been tested in every way, yet without sin. So let us confidently approach the throne of grace to receive mercy and to find grace for timely help. The word of the Lord. Now the gospel, as I mentioned in the written commentary, is finally the third in that series of three that Mark artificially puts in his gospel in chapters 8, 9, and 10 in order to show how we are to die with Jesus. I always start with a prediction of his passion, death, and resurrection. Immediately afterwards, somebody misunderstands what it means to die with Jesus. And then there is, thirdly, a clarification in each of the passages. Obviously, those who have chosen the liturgical readings had no inkling of that. They left out the prediction today of this third series. So just kind of close your eyes and imagine Jesus predicts his passion, death, and resurrection, which he actually does in chapter 10, and then we'll start with the misunderstanding. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." He replied, "What do you wish me to do for you?" They answered him, "Grant that in your glory we may sit one at your right and the other at your left." Jesus said, "You do not know what you are asking. Can you drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" They said, "We can." Jesus said, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right or at my left is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the other 10 heard this, they became indignant at James and John. Jesus summoned them and said, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones make their authority over them felt. But it shall not be so among you. Rather, whoever wishes to be great among you will be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you will be the slave of all. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many." The Gospel of the Lord. This is very interesting. I mentioned already back a month or so ago when we got into this series of predictions, misunderstandings, explanation of what it means to die with Jesus, going back to Mark chapter 8, 9, and 10. Remember verse 30 in each of those chapters just about. that this is a key to understanding the heart of Mark's theology. I read a fair number of commentaries every weekend besides my own, and I have not found one yet that has mention of that series of the predictions, misunderstanding, clarification. Somehow it goes over people's head, even though scripture scholars have mentioned this for a long time. It's deliberately put in there, artificially put in there, in order somehow or another to understand how we are to die with Jesus. And obviously the first one, remember back in chapter 8, we are to die with Jesus by being totally open to whatever God asked of us. The second way we die with Jesus in chapter 9, when the disciples start arguing about who's the head high honcho in the group, is somehow to accept everyone in that community, okay? That's when he brings a little kid over there and says you have to accept even kids into your communities almost on an equal basis with everybody. And then today he has the third of that series. The misunderstanding comes from James and John, who look around rather nicely and say, hey, if this guy gets on, I don't know, local TV shows or something, there's always a little space on either side of him. Why don't we ask for those seats, those glory seats, where mom and dad can ooh and ah about us and say, wow, look at my kids. They really made something of themselves. They are next to this Messiah-type character from Nazareth. Jesus says something that we who took education courses were trained never to say. If somebody asks us a question, we never say, that's a stupid question, or what in the world caused you to ask that question? Nobody who knows the subject matter would ever ask that question. Jesus says that basically. You don't even know what to ask for, he tells James and John. You're looking in the wrong direction. You're following me because you think there's some glory somehow or another in this process of being my disciple. Jesus says there's no glory. There is only service here. That when you look around you and see what other people do in different institutions or different movements, somehow my movement, my reform of Judaism, doesn't lap over into that. I encourage you, he says, never to do that. Never to worry about the glory involved in being a disciple. The only thing you worry about is your service of other people. If you serve other people, then you are my disciple. You're imitating me. You're basically becoming another Christ. That's why back then I constantly remind people also, you had real slavery. Today if somebody says, oh, I'll be your slave, they're obviously using that word slave metaphorically or symbolically or something. Back then, you had real slaves who really were at the beck and call of other people, sometimes under pain of death. Jesus says, in a way, you have to be a slave to other people. And then says, just use me as the example. I came not to be served, what James and John are asking for. I came in order to serve. Very difficult to see that. And he kind of says it in another way right after that, to give my life as a ransom for many people. What's a ransom worth? A ransom isn't worth anything definitively. A ransom is only worth as much as the person being ransomed is worth. As I mentioned in the written commentary this weekend, if somebody kidnapped me and held me for ransom, they might get $1.50 on a good day, and probably would be from people that I owed money to or something. If somebody would kidnap the Pope, I'm sure they'd get a few dollars more. The value comes from the value of the person who is ransomed. That's what Jesus is saying. I want my followers to see their value in the value of the people to whom they minister or whom they serve. If those people are valuable, then I'm valuable. I don't see the value in myself. It's evident to anybody who's Catholic. This has not happened in the Roman Catholic Church on a general basis. There are some individuals, like Oscar Romero, who was canonized last week, who we look at and say, he was a real slave, a real ransom for his people. But normally, we're not. So much so that Pope Francis even says what theologians and certainly scripture scholars have said for the last couple of years. The problem that we have in the Roman Catholic Church about sexual abuse of minors revolves basically around clericalism. That somehow or another, clerics, priests, are special individuals in the church. They should have treatment rendered to them that other people don't have, because in the old days, they're the other Christ. You have to somehow revere them, give them special titles. They wear special clothes. Somebody picks up the tab in restaurants when they eat. Police won't even give them a ticket if they're stopped for speed. They're special. That's clericalism. And it also applies to how certain people treated other people, and especially on a sexual level, and with minors, that really has created this scandal. They got off the hook. Other people wouldn't have gotten off the hook, but clerics did. These aren't people who regard those whom they serve as valuable. They regard themselves as valuable. That applies across the board to all of us. I often encourage people who make banners for churches, for the sacristy or for somehow the whole body of the church, to make a banner that just says, "This shall not happen to you." That's all. Let people think of where that comes from, especially the gospel today from Mark 10. That should always be before our eyes. That particular belief turns the world upside down. It's not how the world operates, certainly, that we are all to be servants of other people, to ransom other individuals, to see our value in their value. Most people don't do that at all. And because they don't do it, we got the world we got. Jesus of Nazareth dreamt of a different world. He couldn't pull it off by himself. That's why very early in his preaching ministry, he invited other people to join him. If we can do this together, Jesus says, we can change the world we live in. We won't pass on to our children or grandchildren the same world that our parents passed on to us. In order to do that, we have to die. And the first way we die is by being open to God. Second way we die is seeing how all belong to one community. And the third way we die is becoming servants of those people. That's why Deutero-Isaiah's disciples, in that fourth song of the suffering servant, Deutero-Isaiah's disciples reflected back after his martyrdom and says, he died for us. He was serving us when he was martyred. No wonder the early church especially took that fourth song and applied so much of it to Jesus. When we read through that fourth song, it's like we're at Good Friday or something. That Jesus died for us, kind of like Deutero-Isaiah died for his disciples. He really followed through on what he encouraged his disciples to do. And if he is the great high priest among us, he's basically redefined what it means to be a priest or a high priest. I don't think Jesus would ever be accused of being clerical in his lifestyle. That would be the last adjective anybody would use from the gospel or the historical Jesus. And certainly not, it should be an adjective used for the risen Jesus and those who try to imitate that risen Jesus in their daily life. We got a long way to go, but if we don't listen to these readings, if we just kind of drift off, or we have a homily today that doesn't bring up what Jesus really is emphasizing and doesn't know anything about those other two predictions, misunderstandings, and somehow or another clarification as Jesus makes. Sometimes I can see where certain people would say it might be better to stay home than to go to church and get the wrong message. Please, we're the ones who should be the message. We're the ones who should proclaim the gospel in our own life, as Jesus said. And the first step in proclaiming that gospel is seeing ourselves as a ransom for others, seeing the value of others in our life, and somehow or another saying, I am willing to die in my service of you, one level or another. Thank you very much.